Good evening and welcome to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. I am Beth Hessel, the Executive Director of the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. On the screen, you also see Tess Galen, our events coordinator who helps make all of this happen, and our guest tonight, who I will introduce very shortly. I welcome all of you to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia to our spring virtual speaker series. If this is your first time attending the Athenaeum, I hope you'll come back to learn more. We are a community of people in Philadelphia and now around the world who love to learn, to read, to engage in conversations about art, history, literature, the current matters of the day, and how our own history has affected and continues to affect us today. We love to learn and grow together. So if you are interested in what you hear, if you enjoyed tonight's program, please do, like Nia, come back and learn more. We would love to have you as a member of our growing family here and around the world. We're also a circulating library, you can see right behind me, with new and old books, and a research library as well, specializing in art, architecture, and architects. Tonight, however, before I introduce our guest, I want to remind anyone who is newish to Zoom how to get the best use out of this meeting. First off, if you are on a computer or a laptop, in your upper right-hand corner, you will see an icon that says either speaker view or gallery view. You want speaker view so that when our speaker is speaking, you are looking at her and her slides and not at me and Tess, and that will help you get the best experience. On the bottom of your screen, you should have a Q&A and a chat. I invite you to use the chat for sending shout outs to our guest tonight and kudos to her for her talk, and the Q&A to ask questions. You can put them down there anytime during her talk and I will moderate them during the Q&A time. If you're on a mobile device and it's hard to find the Q&A, go ahead and put them in the chat and I will scroll through those also to find your questions. They're just easier to find in the Q&A, but we want you to ask your questions any which way and how. Now tonight, it is a delight to welcome Dr. Alaina Roberts to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia, to our lectern as our speaker. Dr. Roberts is a historian who studies the intersection of Black and Native American life from the Civil War to modern day. She's an assistant professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh, and she's here tonight to speak about her newly released book. We were just speaking before we started about one of the places where she did her research was at the American Philosophical Society, right around the corner from us. And when she comes back to do research for a future book, we hope we can get her to come and visit the Athenaeum as well. But tonight, we're glad to have you here virtually. You can also find her publications and writing in the Washington Post, the Journal of the Civil War Era, Al Jazeera, and the Western Historical Quarterly. Tonight, it is a delight to welcome you, Alaina Roberts, to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia, and I invite all of our guests to join me in virtually welcoming you.
Well, thank you so much for having me here virtually. Of course, I wish we could be together in person. I think we're getting back to that soon, so looking forward to that. I want to start by noting that I do virtual presentations a little differently than some people. So I have some PowerPoint slides that I'm going to show you, but after giving you a minute or so to look them over, I'm going to bring you back to my face, not because I want to look at myself, but because I think it's a little easier to concentrate when you're looking at the person that's speaking rather than, a huge image that I've blown up. And so I'm hoping that that format will help you to take in what I'm saying a little better. So this evening, I'm going to begin by telling you an anecdote that really explains how I conceive of the work that I do on the intersection of Black and Native history, and that's particularly in the terms of the framework and argument of my new book. So a few years ago, I had a postdoctoral fellowship at Penn State University. And while I was there, I was thrilled to learn one day that Mae Jemison was coming to give a talk. So you probably know who Mae Jemison is. She was the first Black woman in space. And like many Black girls, I looked up to Mae growing up as an example of not just Black excellence, but Black female excellence, which I think is an important distinction. And so I immediately put the date of this talk in my calendar. I knew I would be there. When the day came, I actually realized I didn't really know what she was going to be talking about. Maybe it would be her journey to be an astronaut. Maybe it would be lessons she had learned along the way. I really wasn't sure, but I knew that I would love it, or so I thought. Now, it turned out Mae Jemison had come to discuss what was, and probably still is, her new project, convincing people all across the globe that a mission to Mars is essential. And so she wove a tale of how on Earth, women and men from different countries and races have been divided, but that if they all work together in their efforts to figure out how to live and come together and survive on Mars, humankind would come together in peace. She said that Mars was the next frontier, and she raved about the scientific advancements being made in this effort. But after I got over my shock, I realized that what Dr. Jemison was actually talking about was colonization. The colonization of a new planet by a group of people, humans, who are consistently divided by race and gender and nationality, and I could go on. But somehow, this vastly intelligent former astronaut was so sure that colonization would bring us together. I was surprised to hear this message, especially from her. I thought to myself, she's a Black woman. She should know that colonization doesn't bring people together, it divides people. And so I ruminated on this. I talked about it with family and friends. I kind of dwelled in this confusion. As someone who had been thinking for years at that point about Black people who had celebrated their freedom through Western settlement, through land ownership, I began to wonder, what does it mean for a Black woman to advocate for colonization? Now, African Americans are the descendants of people enslaved to colonize the Americas. Our labor helped build dozens of countries. And while we don't know whether Martians exist, we as African Americans know the pain that results from colonization. It always involves the exploitation of at least one group of people whose land or labor or resources are used toward this goal. And so maybe it wouldn't be Martians, but it would be someone. To Mae Jemison, Martian colonization represented the possibility of unity and freedom for mankind, but she left out that it would mean exploitation as a means to this end. And this resonated with the experiences and the rhetoric of the people that I wrote about in my book. They too use a particular type of involvement in colonization as a means to an end. If I know right now this anecdote perhaps seems way out of left field, but hopefully you'll see the same connection I saw as I talked to you today about a time and a place, Indian Territory, now known as Oklahoma, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, where Black and Indigenous people used their involvement in an exploitative process, which I call the settler colonial process, to unite their nations and realize freedom and opportunity for themselves. So these people, groups that we don't usually associate with this side of colonization, made statements and took actions that would make us question the ideas that we have about victims and victimizers, oppressed people and oppressors. My paternal family was one of thousands of Black families owned by Native Americans. Originally owned by a white person, members of my family were sold to Chickasaw and Choctaw couples. And after a number of years in Mississippi in the 1830s, my family, along with the Chickasaw and Choctaw Nations, embarked on a journey that you probably know today as the Trail of Tears. And so they made their way to Indian Territory, again, modern day Oklahoma. Now my family shared not just history with these Native people, but also ancestry. And so that is my identity. I am Black and Chickasaw and Choctaw. Now, what really brings this journey about is in the late 1800s and in the late 1700s and early 1800s, white American politicians and reformers began encouraging Native Americans, particularly those in the East and Southeast, to adapt certain aspects of Euro-American culture, like language, clothing, political structures, arguing that this would civilize them. And this idea of civilizing Native people is probably familiar to some of you. So for example, Henry Knox, the Secretary of War under President George Washington, advocated what we call the civilization policy, because he believed that Indians were more like whites, they would be more willing to give up a majority of their land. Then they would ideally use their reduced land holdings like white Americans, engaging in agriculture and private land use and disavowing their former tradition of communal land ownership. As chattel slavery became increasingly integral to white society, white Americans also encouraged Native people to become slaveholders. Slaveholders, of course, being important members of their society. And so as this is going on, all Indian tribes and Indian people are taking on various facets of American culture that suited them and ignoring those that didn't. For example, Christian religion and American gender roles were two things that most people in the Chickasaw Nation didn't immediately fully embrace. But many of the wealthiest, most influential members of 5 Indian nations did begin to buy enslaved Black people. And these are those nations right here. So the Chickasaws and Choctaws, who I've mentioned, the Cherokees, the Seminoles, and the Creeks. And these are 5 of the largest tribes, 5 of the most influential Indian nations still in the United States. Now, these five nations took on other parts of American civilization as well, such as newspapers and governance structures. And for this reason, white Americans called these five nations the five civilized tribes, which historians today really shorten to five tribes. Now, along with slave owning, of course, comes the idea that people of African descent are different and are inferior. And while, as in the United States, the majority of people in these Indian nations didn't own slaves, the Indian elites who did created an economy and a culture that highly valued and regulated slavery and the rights of slave owners. So this is really kind of a parallel slave owning nation that we're talking about, especially in the Chickasaw and Choctaw nations. Now, in the 1830s, an event, or really a process, changed the lives of all of these five tribes and the Black people who lived within them, and that is Indian removal. And so the lead up to Indian removal is that since contact, the British had really struggled to reconcile the fact that they wanted all of this Native American land with the fact that they really didn't have the manpower at first to take it by force. And so they made treaties, they made agreements with Native peoples for land parcels or for control of various regions. Now, this colonial period, during this era, Native people and Europeans negotiated settlement, and actually many times Native people actually had more control. They had more knowledge of the area, more allies. But after the Revolutionary War, coercive white settlement and encroachment on Native American lands steadily increases. And settlers are seeking resources and homesteads, and they have more military backing to take this land by force. As plantation-style slavery spread throughout the 19th century, the five tribes find their land, which is lush and agriculturally rich, under attack. And so white settlers began illegally squatting on their land in the Southeast. State governments follow this lead by sanctioning this trespassing and illegally extending their state laws over Native Americans and their lands. This is all part of an effort to try to force Native Americans to leave, to move themselves voluntarily farther west. And while Native people fought for decades legally and sometimes physically against this, some of them did begin moving west. And in 1830, the federal government, with, of course, President Andrew Jackson at its head, showed its support for what these southern states were doing and signed the Indian Removal Act. Now, Indian removal is sometimes the only thing that we learn about Native Americans in school. And for tribes, it's also a very important part of their history. It's really a foundational story, a journey that solidifies their resilience as people. But one of the things I want you to take away from this evening is that it was also a foundational journey, an important journey for the Black people who were enslaved in these nations. They went along with their owners, they helped them on their journey, cutting wood, laboring for them, helping them along. And these African Americans remember removal as a shared trauma. It really solidifies their membership and their shared history with these people. Now, at this point, most Native history focuses on these tribes, usually especially the Cherokees, moving and kind of getting settled in this new region. And this is important to talk about, of course. Native people did not let the United States government crush their spirit after this forced removal. They built foundations of new nations, they established education systems, governments, newspapers, stores. But for the most part, what narratives about removal leave out is the effect that the five tribes' arrival had on Native people already living in Indian territory, and the methods that the five tribes used to survive and prosper in the region. So this is something that I myself didn't know until I went to graduate school. But there were Comanches, Plains Apaches, Uchis, and other Plains people and Western Native people who had actually long used this region as a hunting ground, as an occasional residence, and they were moved to make room for people who had themselves been moved, been dispossessed. And so these different people, this kind of movement of Native people creates really an antagonistic relationship between the newcomers and the people who had already lived there. And so the Western people begin raiding, sometimes killing these five tribes people. That means sometimes they are kidnapping enslaved people, killing livestock or taking that to eat. And so the five tribes do have to protect themselves. They are in a new land. They don't know the landscape. They also need to create new narratives about themselves, really. This is what every nation does during a time of change. They create new stories to really help their people in times of crisis. But my book looks at the way that the five tribes did this, the way they protected themselves, and the way they really solidified Indian territory as their new home. I argue that they did this by becoming involved in this settler colonial process. And by this, I mean they took on and began using the language and actions that white Americans had used to dehumanize other Native people. And so the five tribes used their status as supposedly civilized peoples to portray these Western Indians as their opposites, as wild and uncivilized, encouraging the United States to subdue them and force them to leave the five tribes and their property alone. But let me give you an example. A man named Peter Pitchlynn was an influential Choctaw thinker who would become chief in his nation. But in 1828, he was just a young man on a scouting mission, surveying the lands that the Choctaws would soon occupy in Indian Territory. Now, after he met some of his future Western neighbors, Pitchlynn wrote this in his journal. "You never saw such a people in your life. Their manners and action are wild in the extreme. They are in a perfect state of nature and would be a curiosity to any civilized man." Now, if I told you a white man said that in the 1800s, that wouldn't surprise you at all. But to know that a native man said that about other native people, that's a little more surprising, right? And this was the language that Peter Pitchlynn and many other leaders and influencers in the Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Cherokee nations continued to use as they wrote letters to their tribal agents and the Secretary of Interior asking for help with these Western Plains people. They didn't necessarily need to call other Native people wild or uncivilized to get American military protection. This protection was actually already included in their removal treaties. But they used this language because, as Native people who were considered civilized, they hoped to motivate the Americans to see themselves in their troubles. After all, white settlers in Arkansas dealt with the very same theft and violence from these Western peoples. And so what we see here is the five tribes creating a dichotomy between themselves and the Western settlers on one side and the Western tribes on the other side. And so over the next few decades, the five tribes actually took this dichotomy even further in order to make their own claims to this new homeland. And that's because it's one thing to live on land that you're forced to move to, but it's another thing to be able to call that place home because you supposedly created it from nothing, because you settled a place that didn't exist as a livable region before you arrived. And this is the narrative that the five tribes create about Indian Territory, even though, as I've told you, Western Native people had already lived there and had already created their own societies there. So another example, in 1840, Cherokee Chief John Ross called Indian Territory and the Western people there the wilderness of the West. So again, wilderness, this term, maybe doesn't seem that bad, but this is really a term that is often weaponized against Native people, usually by white Americans or white Europeans to say, there's nothing here. This is certainly a great place for us to settle, for us to make something out of nothing, supposedly. And so John Ross is using this term in a speech that he's giving to the US House of Representatives because he's seeking to portray his nation as a civilizing force in Indian Territory, as a group of people who are going to build civilized institutions like permanent homes and churches and courthouses, unlike Western Native people who had chosen for the most part not to do this. Now, do I think that every single member of the five tribes felt that they were superior to Western Indians? No. Do I think all of the leaders of the five tribes believe this? It's hard to say. Peter Pitchlynn, for example, was highly educated, and he went to institutions like Choctaw Academy, a school run by a white Kentuckian politician, and there he became well-versed in ideas of civilization and European philosophy and religion. So this is not to say that he was any less Indian, just that he was likely influenced by what he learned. And this adaptation of language used by the settler colonial state should be seen as really a strategy used by members of the five tribes to get something that they needed. And it partially worked. The United States did build a fort, Fort Gibson, to protect them as they asked. But even though the five tribes did it for a reason, for protection, and to lay claim to their new homeland, we must still acknowledge that the five tribes fed into the idea of Native people as savages, as inferior to civilized people as defined by white Americans. And they use this against other Native people. Now, after the Civil War is where we see a different group of people use this very similar language of the settler colonial state to lay claim to Indian Territory land themselves. So when they fought in the Civil War, the five tribes did so again to protect their land claims, but also to protect the institution of slavery. And so as nations where important and influential families owned enslaved Black women and men, the five tribes were very interested in discussions occurring in the United States about slavery, about Black rights, about emancipation. In some nations, like the Cherokee and Creek nations, there were actually large factional disputes over the institution of slavery. And so as we get into the Civil War, the Confederacy is courting the five tribes, and they tell them, we will treat you better than the United States. We will give you congressional representation. We will allow you a say in governmental affairs. We will allow you to keep your land and Indian territory forever. We'll be more reliable at paying you the money from the sale of your southeastern homelands. And all of these are very attractive things to the five tribes because the United States has really been slacking on their promises to them. Now, would the Confederacy actually have kept these promises? Probably not. After all, the Confederacy is made up of states who had just pushed Indians off of their land around 30 years earlier. But still, this is an attractive proposition. Now, the other reason that this is an attractive proposition is geography. And so southern states like Arkansas, Texas are really surrounding Indian territory. And so there is really a fear, a danger that the Confederacy will overrun them anyway if they say no. So we have practical concerns, but also sentimental concerns and shared kind of ideas about the importance of slavery from members of the five tribes. And so during the war, all of the five tribes are split. Member of all of these tribes fought for the Confederacy, fought for the Union, or were refugees who actually fled Indian territory altogether. Around 14 battles are fought in and around Indian territory. And just like in the United States, there are enslaved Black men who leave Indian territory to try to fight for the Union. There are also some who are impressed into service by their Confederate owners, being forced to do labor like hauling forage for them. And so when the war is over, the United States ignores the fact that some tribal members were loyal and fought for the Union. And they also ignore the fact that they hadn't sent the five tribes any protection. They actually refused to even give them extra guns that they had. And instead, they used the fact that some tribal members had fought for the Confederacy against the five tribes. And here is when we get the use of African Americans and Black women and men to undermine tribal sovereignty. And so the US points to the five tribes' affiliation with the Confederacy and says, we no longer trust you. This is deserving of punishment. And we are no longer going to recognize any of the treaties that you've made with us if you don't make a new treaty. This new treaty is basically their official surrender document as well as Reconstruction treaties. And I will explain what I mean by that. These treaties are called the Treaties of 1866. And so all of the five tribes sign them. And one of the most extreme items in these treaties is the cession of land. So the five tribes are forced to give up a substantial amount of the land that they had just moved on to around 30 years earlier. Now, the three other big items in these treaties relevant to our discussion today were that the five tribes had to emancipate the enslaved people in their nations, adopt them as citizens, and give them land. And the Chickasaw and Choctaw nations had to give them specifically 40 acres of land. Now, if you're at all familiar with Reconstruction or really Black history in general, then you know how significant that 40 acres is, because African Americans in the US fought for that and didn't get it. And so this is the United States coming into another nation, an Indian nation, that is supposed to have the right to create its own laws, run its own nation, be completely sovereign in just about every way. And the US is saying, we are going to force you to free enslaved people, something we ourselves could not do without a war. We are going to force you to adopt these people as citizens and give them all the rights of citizens, something we ourselves have not fully done at this point. Was this right? Legally, no. Now, the Cherokee Nation had actually ordered emancipation in 1863. So they were the only one of the five tribes who decided to do this without direct coercion. But all the others, the Creeks, the Seminoles, the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, would they have ever emancipated enslaved people without American intervention? We don't know. After emancipation, would they have given their former slaves rights and citizenship? Maybe. Would they have given them land? Probably not. But this freedom, these rights, and especially this land, put the former slaves of the five tribes on a different plane than African Americans in the United States. It gave them different opportunities, and these opportunities are why so many Black people from the US flocked there after emancipation. It's why Oklahoma has so many Black towns and why it had Black Wall Street. And so this is really one of those interesting historical moments where my identities as both a historian and a descendant of former slaves of Chickasaw and Choctaws, which I call Indian freed people, comes into play. Because I have to recognize something as legally wrong as US intervention in a foreign nation, or as Indian nations were called, domestic dependent nations. But I also have to recognize that people like my family might never have been freed, if not for these legally unjust actions on the part of the United States. And so in this next part of the talk, I'm going to use one of those terms multiple times. So I want to show you what I've just mentioned. And so for the former slaves of Chickasaws, I use Chickasaw freed people, Chickasaw freed woman and man. And then for all of the 5 tribes, I use Indian freed people. So the reason this land designated for Indian freed people in the treaties of 1866 is different and historically significant is because this was Black land receipt through American governmental action. Congressional Republicans had not been able to agree on giving African Americans in the US land. It was really impossible for the majority of Republicans who were moderates to imagine taking land from a white person and giving it to a Black person. As I'm sure you know, property ownership was and continues to be one of the most revered American values. But Republicans such as the Secretary of the Interior and the Commissioner of Indian Affairs at the time could imagine giving Indian land to people of African descent. Because in their minds, the 5 tribes did not value land and private land ownership and did not engage in the kind of animal husbandry and agriculture performed by white men that Americans did. They saw their use of land as uncivilized. They saw them as not really properly utilizing this land. And therefore, giving Indian land away to people of African descent fulfilled this kind of lofty idealistic goal of Black land ownership while allowing whites to maintain their land in the United States. And so here the United States is using this idea of Indian savagery against the 5 tribes, who used to be considered civilized and used that against other Native people. But now that this is no longer politically useful, the 5 tribes are once again uncivilized. And this change allows Black people to take ownership of land in Indian territory. And Indian free people of the 5 tribes played into this idea. Here I'm going to show you a Chickasaw freedman referring to his family work ethic after the Civil War. This man is named Blaine Holman. He says, at that time, the Indians did not have anything but small farms. And of course, the freedmen were reared among them, so they didn't work like they should, but just raised enough corn to make their bread. And so there are a few words here that really point to what Blaine is saying. And so the freedmen are among these Native people, these Native slaveholders. And how are they working? Are they working really hard, really productively, the American way? No, they're not working like they should. They're just raising enough corn to make their bread. And this really plays into the idea of Native people as lazy, a stereotype that still exists. And so Indian freed people are very aware that it was the United States that had negotiated for their land ownership, not their Native former slaveholders. And so some of them align themselves with white Americans and their definitions of civilization and productivity. But Black land ownership was really only one part of American politicians' plan to take Indian land. So in these treaties of 1866, the 5 tribes agreed that they would end their practice of communal land ownership and switch to private land ownership, which, again, as I've told you, is something that the United States has been trying to get them to do for a long time. Now, the US government would survey their lands and then allot them to each Indian family. So just as their former slaves were to receive land allotments, the Indian members of the 5 tribes would also receive land allotments, only larger for some of these tribes. Then, once this land was allotted to each Indian family and freed person family, look at that, there would be leftover land, and this could be conveniently settled on by Americans. Now, this process is complicated, and there's a lot more information I could give you, but simply, the land allotment that the 5 tribes agreed to in these treaties of 1866 is eventually carried out in the 1880s and 1890s with legislation that you may be familiar with, the Dawes and Curtis Acts. Now, during this time period, I'm talking in the 1860s going into the 1880s, news about these treaties and news about the land that Indian free people would receive was being passed around, was being talked around. But Black information networks and Black newspapers were particularly interested in this. And so one newspaper, the Washington Bee, a Black DC newspaper, reported that Indian free people would receive land as well as per capita payments due to these treaties. And they proclaimed that this made them absolutely the wealthiest Negroes in the United States. And so African Americans, many of whom were unable to purchase land and were very disappointed with Republican failure to give them land, bring them land, they began to see Indian territory as a possible paradise, a place where they could latch onto this land that Indian free people would get or claim their own land, a place where they could be free from white violence. And these African Americans moved to Indian Territory by the hundreds, by the thousands, and they created what we call today Oklahoma Black Towns or all Black towns, which were actually often a combination of the land of an Indian freed person and the resources and people from the United States. So one of the most famous Black towns is called Boley. That began with the land allotment of a 6-year-old girl named Abigail Barnett, who was a Creek freed girl. Boley would become the largest predominantly Black town in North America at the turn of the century after a trio of investors began promoting it. And so this is a town that has both African Americans from the United States in it and Indian freed people. Now, some of you likely know about this history of Black towns because I think this is really how Oklahoma is known in the minds of many people, or at least people who know about Black history. But what I wrote about in my book is the way that people of African descent, both African Americans and Indian freed people, looked at Native Americans and this Native American land that they were settling on. And so in the late 19th century, African Americans began to formulate political and social arguments aimed at white Americans regarding their qualifications for land ownership in the West, which they believed were superior to Native Americans. They also urged continued American intervention into tribal affairs. So the example I have for you is one of the most famous African American leaders of the 19th century, and really of all time, Frederick Douglass. Douglass gave several speeches where he talked about how African Americans might find land and peace in the West, and how the United States should support this endeavor financially. But to support his appeal, Douglass actually denigrated Native Americans. So in a speech to the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1869, Douglass argued this: "The Negro is more like the white man than the Indian in his tastes and tendencies and disposition to accept civilization. The Indian rejects our civilization. It is not so with the Negro. He loves you and remains with you under all circumstances in slavery and in freedom." And so here, it almost seems like Douglass is equating slavery with African Americans sharing kind of bond with white Americans. And of course, in a sense they are, but he is certainly framing it as, again, a dichotomy between this time Black and white Americans on one side and Native Americans on the other, the bad side. In another earlier speech called Land for the Landless, Douglass says something similar. He says, "The peopling of the national domain with an enterprising, intelligent, and hardy race of immigrants, transforming the savage wilderness into flourishing civilized communities, multiplying new states, and adding immensely to the wealth and productive industry of the nation, would extend the area of freedom, and it would increase the political power of the North and West, the power of the people. It would dangerously menace the perpetuity of the institution of slavery and the democratic slaveholding aristocracy built upon it." And so, these are good things, right? Yes, we want to eliminate the power of the democratic slaveholding aristocracy. We want to extend the area of freedom. But in order to do this, well, we have to transform the savage wilderness. And so you see these words that we've talked about, savage, wilderness, they're code words, essentially. They're key words that really mean that Native Americans are supposedly different from white and Black Americans, supposedly less than, inferior. Now, Douglass is an educated man. He is familiar with both Native Americans and Indian reformers. He knew that this land was not free, that it had not always been the national domain, but actually that it had been taken from Indian hands. He also knew that a swell of American immigration into the region would change and worsen circumstances for Native people. And yet he uses this language of savagery and civilization, to juxtapose what the region was supposedly like in Indian hands, the wilderness, and what it might be like after an interracial American immigration of whites and Blacks. Now, these two speeches are given about 4 years apart, and so they represent a pretty sustained belief on the part of one of the most famous Black radicals of his time that African Americans deserve to share in the settler colonial spoils of the Native West. And when I found these sources, it was almost just as surprising as hearing Mae Jemison talk about colonization. It's not the Frederick Douglass that I knew. Though just like the 5 tribes use the language of the American settler colonial state to further their goals of protection and claiming land, so too people of African descent use this same language to argue for land and rights for themselves. And Douglass was not the only Black leader who spoke like this. Many of the Black men who founded Oklahoma Black towns spoke like this. Many of the Black editors who wrote pieces encouraging Black migration to the West spoke like this. And so what my book's argument really boils down to is that my identity allowed me to see past the categories that we traditionally put Native and Black people into. We might see them as victims or as people who had horrific events occur in their lives and fought back against them. And so we celebrate their triumphs. And of course, I understand why. But when confronted with the complexities of their actions and the ways in which their words affected others, are we willing to see Black and Native people in a different way? Can we accept the fact that people who suffered so much from settler colonialism as dispossessed peoples, as forced laborers, as forced reproducers of mixed race children, can we accept that these same people could also act in a capacity that served the colonial state? Can we accept the fact that sometimes they adopted this language of the colonial state and used it to their own ends? We often talk about white settlers' involvement in this settler colonial process and the system of white supremacy. But when Black people settled the West, seeking their freedom and opportunity, they were also stunting the freedom and opportunity of Native people. And there are other cases that you could argue are similar, such as African American settlement in Liberia or Sierra Leone in the 19th century. But as I wrote my book, I realized that Indian territory represents really a particular merging of several groups' desires to colonize and rebuild in their own image. And yes, of course, white settlers were part of this, but so were people of Native and African descent. And if we removed what we know and feel about Native and Black people and just looked at their actions, would we recognize them as, at times, acting in service of this settler colonial state? You know, it always made me so proud and so thankful that I come from people on my paternal side that had land, that had oral stories that talked about how important this land was to them and the various events that took place on this land. I know that it's amazing that I, as a Black woman, can still to this day go to Ardmore, Oklahoma and see the church that my family built in the 1890s. I can see the cemetery that has ancestral graves going back over 100 years. And that is not something that many Black people can say because, of course, of our history of enslavement. But as I wrote this book, I realized that my joy came at someone else's expense, that the land that allowed my family and hundreds of others in Indian Territory to be rare Black landowners was part of the broader theft of Native land. And of course, that's also tied to the loss of much Native culture and language. I also realized that my Native ancestors, the Chickasaws and Choctaws, had built amazing nations on land that they had been forced to take from other Native people that they had then portrayed as inferior to themselves. And so how do I reconcile that in my head? As a historian, as a free person descendant, I have to see it and accept it as another way of looking at Black and Native history, as a way that allows us to see African Americans and Native Americans as an example of how oppressed people can oppress other people. And so as we discuss decolonization and the evolution of Black history and Black studies and Native American history, I think that we're now in a place that we can connect Black and Native histories in a way that problematizes some of the negative things our ancestors did. We know that they survived and were resilient, but in trying to realize their own freedom, what other groups did they victimize? And I don't see this as kicking people who are down. I don't see this as trying to vilify people who were just trying to pull themselves up from slavery. I see this as trying to learn and teach the full truth of history, trying to understand as much as possible how Black and Native people of the past thought. And so when Mae Jemison spoke emphatically about the benefits of Martian colonization, I'm sure she wasn't thinking about this kind of entanglement, but when we look back at American history and forward toward Black, Native, and white alliance, I think we should consider the complexities of colonization. And it will mean wrestling with some hard truths, but I would like to think that we're ready to do that. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Alaina. This is, as George said in the text, this is absolutely fascinating. Thank you for bringing this perspective of both new knowledge and new understandings, but ways of looking at histories of so many peoples in the U.S. in different ways and understanding in new ways. So thank you on behalf of everyone who's here. I invite you, if you have questions, to put them in the Q&A or the chat. I'm going to open both of those right now so I can keep an eye. Yes, again, bravo, insightful, lots of wonderful thank yous from people. Jonathan has a question here. He says, a rather niche question perhaps, he says, but I'd be interested to know how you situate the quote, wilderness of the West mindset in the global terra nullius colonizer doctrine. He says he's more familiar with how this was deployed in Australia. For instance, he wonders, did Douglas or others take examples from beyond America?
Yeah, that is a good question. As far as I know, Black thinkers and intellectuals don't really use that, kind of the examples of other countries. Some white people who are advocating for settlement and colonization do, but when Douglas and others talk about colonization, they're really kind of situating it in thinking that is about kind of freedom and settlement as a way to kind of add to the body of Americanness. And so it's kind of really a buy-in to, you know, all the ideas of like American democracy and egalitarianism. I can never say that word. But there are people, like there are congressional leaders who talk about colonization kind of more in that sort of way, who advocate for Black people to go to various parts of Africa as a way to not only bring Christianity, but civilization.
There's another question, curious. So the treaties of 1866, how many African Americans were provided with land in that process?
There are about 10,000 who initially get land in the 1880s and 1890s when this is eventually being parceled out. And then of course their descendants share that land. So like my father at this point owns still the land allotment that our family has. And it's just every generation it's passed down. So now it's like, I don't even know, 40 people on the deed or something crazy.
That's amazing. And did this create something like that African Americans took the language of Native Americans being uncivilized and bought into that? But did this whole process increase animosity among the 5 tribes who were there and the African Americans who had been enslaved but now had land that they felt had belonged to them?
Definitely. The relationship between these two groups of Black people is very interesting because there is a lot of intermarriage and there's a lot of, certainly, as I've said, like creating communities together and seeing common cause. But then there are also Black people, Indian freed people who want to be part of their tribes and see African Americans coming from the US as interlopers and say, you know, don't bring any of that here. We don't want you here. As more Black people come, the 5 tribes begin to get really afraid, especially the Chickasaws, who are the smallest of the tribes, and they are afraid of essentially being seen as the Black nation rather than as an Indian nation, which could spell trouble for their tribal sovereignty and their status as a political nation.
Yeah, which I think Daryl's question leads, your response leads into his question. He's wondering if tribes are still either kicking out or denying membership to Black members based on DNA or the Dawes tribal roles. And his second part is, are the Black members active in the tribes?
So the first part of the question, yes, they are definitely still denying citizenship and rights. Right now, the Cherokees are the only tribe who fully accepts Black citizenship or Black Cherokee citizenship. And that was really only after a legal battle of around 20 to 30 years, depending on who you ask. All of the 5 tribes in the 70s and 80s started creating legislation or using referendums to kick these people out, Indian free people descendants, basically saying, you know, you're not Indian, you're an interloper, you're taking the things that, you know, we use our money for, or you're getting all these benefits for nothing. And it was a complete, really bastardization of what had happened, because obviously they are members of the tribe through a treaty. Like, it doesn't actually necessarily matter if they're Indian or not, but the language was really racialized. And so it's been a long battle by descendants to spend their own money to launch legal action against the tribes to try to get them to do this. The Seminole freedmen are currently working on a case. I think they're currently the only people who have a case right now, but yeah, it's still very much an open issue that has a lot to do with, you know, racism and prejudice. Okay, I'm forgetting the second question. The second part.
Are Black members active in the tribes of which they are members?
Yes. So in the Cherokee Nation, one of the women who led the legal fight for Cherokee Free People, her name is Marilyn Van. She just ran for tribal council. And so she, were she to win, would be like the most prominent Black Indian in the nation. But the current chief, Chief Chuck Hoskin, has done a lot of work to make Free People descendants feel included. He's working on kind of reworking the museums to put that history in the narrative. He's working on making sure that there are Black Native representatives in different Cherokee Nation positions. So the Cherokee Nation is certainly a model of what I hope all the other tribes will do at some point in the future.
Thank you. Thank you. And Nia's wondering if you could address a little bit the similarities or differences between colonization and caste systems. She thinks, especially when we think of the way that marginalized people are separated in as you said, settler colonialism and caste systems. Are there any similarities?
I admit I don't know kind of the formal definition of a caste system. I was sort of following the conversation about Isabel Wilkerson's book about kind of, can you talk about caste and race as separate, or are they kind of inextricably linked? I feel like colonization in the United States, especially, there is so much movement initially between people of different races and status. And I kind of am talking about that in my book and in this talk about how you can easily be seen as one thing at one point in time, and then later on you're seen as another thing, another inferior thing. So I think that shows that it's not kind of set in stone, the idea of someone's certain rights based on like kind of their lineage or their place in society, like a caste system, as I believe it is. But I don't want to really say any more because I would just be speaking uninformed.
Which is fair. And it's interesting that I'm thinking about it as you describe these complex interplays among white Americans, African Americans, and Native Americans, that there was no really set caste. It was, if you could get a leg up, then you'd try to push somebody else out of the way so that you could get your leg up. And it wasn't Native Americans are always at the bottom or African Americans are always, but this interplay, a little more movement than you might have in a caste system, a strict caste system. That's a fascinating question. I think I'm going to be thinking about this tonight, Nia. Larry's wondering about what happened to the tribes such as the Comanches and others who were dispossessed by when the 5 tribes were forced into their land.
They were still there, kind of smushed into a smaller portion, and as Oklahoma territory is eventually created, and then Oklahoma becomes a state, their portions get smaller and smaller because the U.S. is taking more and more of that land to be settled on by whites. So you have the various kind of land runs that are kind of the Oklahoma foundational story, the Sooners, the Boomers. And so today, most of those nations are far kind of poorer and not really, like, you don't really see discussions about them in the media. I think some people even forget that they really kind of exist in Oklahoma, whereas the 5 tribes really kind of dominate the narratives about the state, even though they're not even really originally from there, which I've always found so interesting.
That is really, thank you. So Tess is saying she coming from the East Coast, she's more familiar with tribes in the East Coast, and wondering if in your study and research, what you could say about the types of relationships that maybe East Coast, more Eastern tribes had with free Black people or slaves during the same time period.
Eastern tribes, because they had much earlier interactions with Black people, and there were far more kind of free and autonomous Black people in the earlier period, 1600s, even mid 1700s. There was kind of far more of an equal exchange. There were plenty of Black people who lived in Eastern tribes, like the Wampanoags were one, the Pequots, people who today even kind of you know, their phenotype betrays this kind of long history of interaction and interrelationships with Black people. But just as the 5 tribes were afraid of having too much kind of inclusion of Black people because it put into jeopardy their tribal sovereignty, the Eastern tribes ran into that as time went on. So into the 1800s, and especially when we get into the early 1900s, when the at the time Office of Indian Affairs, now the BIA, is kind of cataloging Indianness in a sense. They're kind of creating the idea of what an Indian looks like, and making sure that that really predicts whether someone's going to be state recognized or federally recognized tribe. And so there is a lot writing on the way you look and the interactions that your tribal members have with Black people. And so the relationships that we see between Native and Black people really change and over the kind of course of, say, 100 years, due to really increasing racism and the desire of white Americans to categorize people as only Black or only white or only Native American.
Well, Shannon says, thank you so much. This topic is so under discussed, and when it is, there's a lot of blame assigning or finger pointing. So this was presented so beautifully, she says, and she will definitely read the book. I hope everyone who is here tonight will read the book. You can, if you're a member, you can check it out from the Athenaeum, but if you don't want to wait in line for it, you can also order it. And we encourage you to buy it from bookshop.org, and Tess can put that up. So you can see the link.
There it is.
And there's the beautiful cover. So did you get to choose the photographs that went on the front cover?
I did. So these are my family members. My great and great grandmother, and there's the great grandmother with 2 of her half brothers. So this is, I mean, if it's not already obvious, this is just a very personal story for me. And I'm, you know, very happy that I can talk about it and use it to enlighten this kind of complex history that I think people are often afraid to wade into, and talk about how, you know, this is difficult.
It's fascinating. I think as more and more people start doing their DNA tests and start finding more about their family histories and studying their genealogy and their family trees, we start learning that there are stories in our own family history that maybe we have ignored or has, you know, been kind of shoved aside throughout the years. And this is, you provide a wonderful example of how to do this research and approach it. So thank you so much. This is so wonderful. So I hope everybody will purchase the book, and encourage your friends and family. It sounds like a perfect book to give to folks who are graduating, so they can continue learning and thinking. Father's Day is around the corner. I Love You, Friend is a great time to buy a book and share it with them. So I hope you will all do that. And thank you to Alana Roberts for giving us the time this evening for a really fascinating conversation. Everyone who attended will receive a link to the recording, so that you may watch it. We will not be putting it up online in general, as Alana does her book tour, but you will have access for it. And hope you will come back to our other programs next week or this week. Let's see, we have on Thursday, Nina Gelbart with Women of Science and the French Enlightenment, continuing with the look at women in Europe keeping house in 17th century England by Margaret Lincoln, calling over from England. Actually, it's going to be very late for her on next Tuesday. Next Friday, come join us for the last of our spring chamber music concert, socially distant and masked chamber music concert in our reading room with Jordan Dodson playing classical guitar. If you are able to come in person, we love it. We're also live streaming it. You can register for either. So we are so pleased to have you all here tonight. If you are new, again, we invite you to visit our website, to visit us in person, to give us a call. We'd love to tell you more about becoming a part of our family and our community. And you can also follow us on social media or sign up to receive our weekly e-newsletter to find out more about what is happening. And Before we log off, you can go ahead and add your thanks and thoughts to the chat for Dr. Roberts. And thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.